Good afternoon. Welcome to the October Create Cadence webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about project recovery, a subject very close to my heart. Many projects I've got involved with over the years have been what you might term recovery projects. We're really going to help you with some structures, some frameworks, some tactics to be able to understand the reasons why projects get into a crisis state and need to engage in project recovery. We're going to give you some tips around how you can prevent projects from getting to that stage, from getting to a place of crisis. And then we're also going to give you a 7-stage framework that explains what you can do when you find yourself in a project that's in a crisis situation to get yourself out of it. So for those of you who haven't been on one of our webinars before, my name's Adam Lawrence. I'm the founder of Create Cadence, a 25-year project management veteran. And Create Cadence is the consultancy that I set up to take away the pain of project management, the challenges that we all find in project delivery, and introduce structures, approaches for our clients to enable them to achieve their ambitions and deliver successfully when it comes to their project work. So today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Alex McKay. Alex and I have known each other for around 40 years, which is quite a scary number to say. But Alex has had a long career in the British Army, has managed the types of projects with numbers, consequences, people that I guess us in the corporate software world probably can't quite get our heads around. But huge experience in project and program management within the military, and then subsequently in his career in the public and private sector. So I think Alex is going to really bring his experience and know-how and talk us through some of the approaches that he's taken in his career to date to prevent crises in projects and to help resolve them when he's found himself in those situations. So Alex, I've given you a little intro there. I don't know if you want to tell us a bit more about your sort of experience and background.
Morning, Adam. Great to see you again. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I was a soldier for 26 years, and I've been working in the public and the private sector since for a couple of years on various projects and programs. And I suppose at this point, it's just worth busting a few myths, if there were any out there. Although the environment is different in the military and the consequences in some cases are quite severe when projects or programs go wrong, they are just projects and programs. We're talking here about project management with the same sorts of frameworks applied as in the private or the public sector, change management, risk management, leadership. It's all the same stuff. It's just a slightly different environment. And my experience is that the frameworks can apply on both sides of that corporate versus military fence. And they're really good when they're applied. And if we were to end this webinar now after just a couple of minutes, then one of the biggest reasons for failure is not following those basic frameworks and applying them in an effective or an efficient way.
Great, thanks, Alex. So before we get started, as usual, we really welcome any questions from any of you on the webinar today. The Q&A function should be available on Zoom. So as we're going through, if anything comes up, if you've got any burning questions you'd like us to answer, we're hoping to have a little bit of time at the end to pick up on some of those questions. So please do fire any thoughts, questions you've got around project recovery, and we'll do our best to answer them. Any we can't get to, we'll come back to an answer in the follow-up notes that come. So I guess, Alex, a real starting point I think is to define what we would call a crisis in project management terms, actually, and perhaps start to think about what the common causes are that we see in project management and project delivery for crises. So let's start with that definition. How would you define, or how would you think about a crisis in project terms?
So I think a project crisis is characterized by a significant disruption or an unforeseen event during a project, one that threatens its success and that requires immediate intervention to prevent failure. failure in itself is a crisis, but there are many signs that can be dealt with before we get beyond the crisis into failure. And then when we're talking about project failure, we're talking about an inability to meet a project's objectives within the agreed scope or time or budget or quality requirements or constraints. And that inability results in a complete or a partial inability to deliver the intended outcomes of the project. And that's the same in the military as it is in the public sector, as it is in the private sector. It's about understanding those key requirements and spotting when there is a risk that they won't be achieved, or indeed that the project just fails to achieve them completely.
Okay, sounds very familiar in terms of definition. And what if we focus in on some of the, if you were to list out what you see as common causes really of project needing to go into that recovery kind of phase.
Yeah, so two macro groups, internal and external, and things that might cause a crisis or a failure could be a budget overrun or a high rate of team turnover, some sort of technology failure, supply disruptions, or a regulatory or compliance or political issue. Indeed, a competitor doing something in the project environment that leads to a crisis or failure. Many of those are external. Three internal reasons, and three that I'm seeing a lot of this year and have done in the past, are missed deadlines due to poor time planning or poor time management, scope creep, and stakeholder misalignment or conflicts within a project. All three of which can be dealt with internally. We have agency over within a project environment as long as there's a motivation to do so.
Okay, yeah, like you say, those three feel again quite familiar. Just to sort of pick up on a couple of those. So when you talk about missed deadlines due to poor time management, I think was the phrase that you used. I guess that could be split into a couple of different or framed in a couple of different ways. I guess one of the challenges that I really see within projects is problems in estimating. It's an over optimistic kind of view of how long a project's going to take, or a misunderstanding of some of the complexities in the project, and that then putting the project on the back foot from the start, and it's very hard to kind of recover from that sort of situation. Is that when you're talking about time management? Is it that, or is it kind of the actual running of the project and the delivery, or a little bit of both?
A little bit of both and more. In a military context or in a sports context, as I do a lot of sailing, a lot of the evolutions you go through. If you start well, then you can finish well. But if you start badly, it's very difficult to get things back on track. And so to manage your time well, you need to have gone through some form of time planning beforehand. And so what I see a lot of is insufficiently thought through or resourced time planning at the beginning of the project, where project managers or schedulers don't come up with a plan to plan, which is a step in itself, and that leads to inherently over-optimistic views of the time it might take to complete a project, which in turn means that tasks take longer than expected and key deliverables are delayed, projects fall behind schedule, and then there's pressure from stakeholders that leads to a loss of confidence. And then you can see crises beginning to occur, and then they oftentimes lead to project failure because of the inertia that's created through those misunderstandings.
Yeah, I like that planning how you're going to plan. It kind of feels that that's quite an important step. I mean, again, something I see quite often in the corporate world is a real rush to action. You want to get your spade in the ground, if you like. You want to start working on the project, but I guess the danger with that is that you're overlooking the planning process. You're overlooking how you're going to manage the project, and often, well, yes, you've got your spade in the ground early, you end up paying for it further down the line. Is that something that kind of resonates with you?
It really does. Yeah, I recognize it completely. And what we're really talking about here in P3M terms is project initiation and doing it well and really resourcing it. In the military, you would have what's called a question zero. You would have a receipt of orders. You'd sit down with all of your stakeholders and brief that and conduct a really early analysis of what it was you were being asked to do and some environmental factors, just over an hour or two, and then developing a plan to plan, working out how much time and resources required in order to initiate the project before you really get into it. We can talk about that a bit more, maybe under preventative measures.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a phrase in a book I read recently was about I think it was about plan slowly, act fast. Whereas I think a lot of organizations almost miss that plan slowly bit out and just go straight to act fast, which then has consequences further down the line.
Mm.
Um, so just think about, I don't know if we can dig into those other kind of areas a little bit more. So stakeholder misalignment. What are the real challenges that you kind of see around that within projects that can lead to failures?
I think stakeholder misalignment and conflict is where stakeholders, internal and external, have differing visions or priorities for the project. At a simplistic level, you might have a marketing team that wants to add more features to a product while the technical team is insisting on sticking to an existing plan to meet deadlines. Those sorts of things, are in some ways inevitable, but good change controls in place can be dealt with. Project people, though, cause all sorts of misalignment and conflicts that you might not expect. I was working on a project last year that had really well-defined requirements, actually a pretty well-scheduled plan, really great sponsorship. But for whatever reason, one management layer down, there was disagreement about what the project should deliver or could deliver. And a couple of agendas meant that some of those lower level managers began to either avoid or resist or maybe even sabotage elements of the project. Either way, there was misalignment and conflict between internal and external parties. And as a result, you end up with conflicting objectives that causes delays in decision making, projects stall, as the teams struggle to agree what to do, as they try to identify what the organization's priorities really are, if indeed priorities have been set in the first place. And then the crises build over time to include frustration and wasted resources and those types of internal politics that I was alluding to, and big problems within a project environment.
Yeah, I was just reminded of that old. There's a project management. I'm not sure if it's a joke or not, but it's a kind of saying that projects would be easy without the people, or a project delivery it would be easy apart from the people. But I guess what that gets away from is projects are people. It's all about behaviors. It's all about, and if you expect people to act in a robotic machine-like way, you're going to be disappointed because there's all sorts of egos, emotions, motivations going on within a project, which have to be thought about in order to
Yeah, they
achieve.
can't be ignored. They've just got to be understood.
Yeah.
And linked to what you were just saying there, I had a wonderful line the other day. It's amazing how far small project teams can go if no one cares who takes the credit. If you can somehow build into your project team's culture, but it doesn't matter who's taking the credit. We're just going to work together with our stakeholders to achieve whatever the project requires.
Yeah.
You'll go a long way. But as soon as
Yeah.
ego kicks in and people begin to feel that they're not being rewarded for their part in the plan, things quite often go slower.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's great. I'm going to take that one on. So moving on from the causes then to think about, we'll start with prevention before we get into recovery. Obviously, prevention better than cure. So we're going to talk about the cure in a bit. But if we think about prevention, and think about some of those common causes, what are some of the preventative approaches that businesses can take in projects that you've seen in your experience that can reduce the likelihood of a crisis or a project recovery situation occurring in the first place?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. Prevention is so much better than cure. And that's visceral. You really feel that in a military environment, because when you're talking about risk hazards in that environment, you're talking about life and limb type issues. Sure, money is important, business health is important, but you feel it, and you want to prevent those types of risks rather than mitigate, i.e., soften the impact of them. And so, one of the messages I'd really like to broadcast as a part of this webinar is that although prevention has a resource cost associated with it, that cost is oftentimes lower than mitigating the impact of hazards or digging yourself out of a hole later on. And so in that context, I would go back to more detailed and effective planning, better resourced planning, coupled with flexible and adaptable delivery of projects, whereby we plan effectively and efficiently to build a genuinely valid project plan while maintaining a mindset of flexibility and adaptability throughout execution. And there's a few things I learned in my time in the army that help here. First, we can build over time. As plan, we've talked about that, with well-trained and well-practiced teams in place to analyze the project environment, the project requirement, and the project to be done. And there's a few key things in there. Rather than solely focusing on what we've been asked to deliver as the project, taking time to understand the environment that the project will be delivered in really helps too. And if we really resource and well train those teams, then they can be held to account for their plan's validity. And each option they can come up with can be judged against what we would know as FACES criteria, so FACES, in that their plan or their options must be proven to be feasible, acceptable, complete, exclusive, and suitable, with criteria set against those 5 elements. And during the planning process, we would conduct scenario testing, or what's known as wargaming, to really stress test the plan and ensure its validity. And then after it's been set and scheduled, we might conduct what's called a rehearsal of concept, a drill whereby each of the stakeholders involved in the plan, as a part to play in the plan, might be affected by the plan, talks through their part in it, so that we can be sure that they genuinely understand it, and also get to describe what their dependencies are on all the other stakeholders throughout the delivery process.
Yeah, sorry, just jumping in. There's a couple of things in there I think are really interesting that you've described that I think you don't tend to see so often in the corporate world. Well, I guess when you think of military, one of the things you think about is drills, and you talk about practice. You don't tend to see project teams practicing, if you like. You don't tend to see project plans getting stress tested in the corporate environment. They're just you just go straight into it, and you get on with it. And I guess if you think about that scenario, it's no wonder that there's quite often failures that happen, because you haven't really experimented, you haven't really gathered experience amongst the team, you haven't really drilled the team in how this project's actually going to work before you actually go straight into the real life action, I guess.
Yeah, and there could be any number of reasons for that. May not occur to people. It's not something that's been taught, then why would you do it? If you do conduct that scenario testing or wargaming or those rehearsal of concept drills, there can be a real stigma associated with objective feedback, because a planning team will, of course, be emotionally wed to some elements of their plan. Perfectly human and natural for them to feel that way. And by testing it, you're gonna pick holes in it. There's a danger that they may feel some sort of negative consequence to that. So adopting those sorts of practice or deploying those sorts of practice does require there to be a very trusting relationship between the project teams and their stakeholders, whereby it's okay to be challenged, and it's okay to have gaps identified in your plan, and to have it picked apart. That's not easy. That takes time. It takes resource. It takes investment on a personal level.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. We probably could do a whole another webinar on that, to be honest. But I think there's some really interesting points to take away from that as an approach. And I've no doubt that would, like you say, upfront investment, but pays massive dividends further down the line. You're better off finding a hole in your plan on day one than on day 100. You know. Okay, so
And
that
sorry,
was
Adam,
the
you,
that.
you you just reminded me of something that
Mhm.
Dan Dower talked about in a previous webinar. He says shift left,
Mm,
build quality in left, bring it left on the timeline.
mm.
It's just so much cheaper than dealing with issues later on.
Yes, yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So that was planning, and then I think you were talking about some other areas like preventative approaches.
Mm.
Mm.
Well, yeah, there is a risk assessment and management.
Hmm.
And I'd excuse everyone a bit of a yawn as I say that. It gets a bad rep with many people. But I'm talking about something that goes beyond, just working out the likelihood and the impact of a particular set of risks or causes, and getting into a space whereby the project is genuinely driven by an understanding of the risks associated with it. And when I'm talking about risks, I'm talking about opportunities as much as hazards.
Mm.
So, bronze standard is, conduct those risk management or risk assessment working groups, work out where risks may lie within the project environment. But then when you've done that and you've worked out where the highest likelihood and impact is, really get into the detail of what that means. Conduct what some people know as bow tie assessments, where we break open each risk hazard and we list the most likely causes of that risk event occurring, that hazard, affecting us. And then if we can work out what the causes may be, spend time identifying how we can prevent that cause from manifesting itself. That's something that I've noticed project managers, change managers, risk managers miss in terms of their risk management cycles. They forget to prevent the risk from becoming an issue in the first place. That said, stuff happens. If the hazard does manifest itself, then we want to work out what the mitigative controls might be, how we might soften the impact of that risk hazard, and then go a step further and design genuinely valid contingency plans to deal with those things. And off the back of it, work out where the opportunities may lie in any particular risk area.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I guess what I'm taking from that is, the risk management of risk is not a tick box or a risk log filling exercise. It's got to genuinely be at the heart of what you're doing and driving your behaviors on the project, in order to have any chance of actually being helpful.
And I think the reason that people are taken towards mitigation post
Mhm.
event is because of the word management. There's
Mm,
something tangible there to
mm,
manage, and it misses the preventative element, which it has its cost implications as well.
mm,
In a military sense, there's a parallel with deterrence. We talk a lot about military deterrence, nuclear deterrence, physical deterrence. It's very difficult, though, to prove that your deterrence strategies have actually had an impact. And so oftentimes what you'll see is people investing heavily in deterrence and succeeding, and then a budget manager or a leader who's under the cosh for budgets saying, well, why did we bother spending all that money? It didn't happen. And then
mm,
people like me having to step forward and say, well, the reason it didn't happen is because we did all those things. And that avoided a hazard occurring that would have cost us 10 times as much. So it's a difficult sell, but I think it's a sell worth getting into. And if you conduct that more deep bow tie analysis of causes and preventative measures with a hazard costed, and then some mitigative steps,
yeah.
you can prevent the crisis or failure happening in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. And I know when we were sort of preparing for this, Alex, we talked about a pre-mortem, and these are things I've done on projects. I know you see the value in them. Just for sake of the people on the webinar, can you just sort of explain briefly what they are and why they're effective?
Yeah, a pre-mortem analysis attempts to identify the causes of failure before the failure occurs. As opposed to a post-mortem when you've already got a dead project and you're trying to figure out what happened.
Mm,
I just think it's a wonderfully proactive method that the team can use. And all they need to do is imagine that the program or the project has failed and work backwards to identify what the possible reasons for that failure were. And given the reasons, then work out the preventative controls that could be put in place. And they're not difficult to run. I mean, don't get me wrong, sometimes useful to bring in an external facilitator or consultant just to work the process through. But in essence, we start with the assumption that the project has failed, get all of the project team and stakeholders in a room to brainstorm the reasons for failure, and then prioritize those reasons or issues based on likelihood and impact, and then conduct a 5 whys evolution where you would say, well, okay, well, why did that thing happen? And why did that happen? And why did that happen? And why did that happen? Trying to get to the root cause of a particular issue. Or conduct a fishbone analysis, which is pretty similar. And then once you've identified the causes, brainstorm preventative actions for each of those high impact reasons, and then do something about it. Write the business case for whatever activity is required to prevent that thing from happening. And by identifying those weaknesses or failure modes in the project preemptively, then we avoid the crisis in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I like about pre-mortems is that I think somehow it takes some of that heat and ego out of a situation, because you tend to find people will say, oh yeah, that failure might have happened because my team didn't communicate well with the other team. You're not actually saying they did that. You're almost kind of giving them the license to kind of open up and be a bit more like, yeah, that might have happened because we didn't communicate very well. So how do we stop? How do we make sure we do communicate well? Somehow doing it up front, yeah, like I say, it takes some of the heat and the emotion out of things, which in a lessons learnt session, you're never going to get that because everyone's on the defensive at that stage. So that's why one of the reasons I really like those types of assessment.
Wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah. So if you move on to talk about, if you find yourself in a crisis situation, I think we've got a slide to share here with the 7. Let me. Is that showing on screen okay, Alex? Is it?
No, I can't see it, I'm afraid.
Just a moment.
There we go.
There we go. Yeah. So I think we're just going to be showing this on screen so people can see it. If you just quickly walk through the 7 steps, and then we'll go through them in a little bit more detail. So this is the 7-stage recovery framework when you find you're sitting with a project that's in a crisis situation.
Yeah, sure. So 7 steps, and just before we go into them, a quick word on frameworks and doctrine, as it's called, I guess, in the military. It has a stigma associated with it. It feels quite bureaucratic having these different frameworks and steps. But my goodness me, when you're under pressure and something's gone wrong, it is useful to have an aide-memoire or a guideline, set of guidelines to follow. Because when you're under stress and tired and people are quite emotional around you, it's easy to misstep or to miss something obvious. So I really like going back to these sorts of frameworks when under pressure. In a military context, you getting shot out or something's going horribly wrong, you would pull out what's called your tactical aid memoir. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but literally in a muddy field somewhere in Afghanistan, I very often got it out, got to the right page, and just followed through the steps in my mind to make sure I don't miss something obvious. And as often as not, I would have done if I hadn't have used that framework or that aid memoir. So I'd advocate these sorts of systems to anyone that finds himself in that sort of situation. But the steps themselves, first of all, step 1, understand the crisis and ask yourself, what's the situation? What's really happening out there in the project environment? And really get to the root of the problem. Most often, it's not the thing that most immediately springs to mind. Biases like confirmation bias or availability bias kick in. People become quite defensive, begin to blame other people. And that creates, that obscures the root cause of the problem. So, really understand the crisis, understand the situation, and work out how it's affecting you. Then step 2, stop the bleeding. Stabilize the situation. Step 3, once you've calm things down enough is to realign the project, to reset it, get it back onto a firmer footing, rebuild the foundations if required. And then we can get into implementation of a recovery plan that hopefully gets us back in good shape. Now, subsequent steps, but perhaps conducted concurrently, it's really important to support the team, manage their morale and the motivation, and to keep improving. Once you've begun to implement that recovery plan, to achieve continuous improvement, learning and adaptation, and then to finish strong, having regained some momentum, maintain it to project closure and conduct a post-recovery evaluation exercise so that the next project benefits from what you've learned during this crisis or failure.
Yeah, I was going to suggest, Alex, is maybe if we just, I know you've kind of covered them at a high level, just maybe just stepping down in each of those steps around some of the practical ways that project managers, leaders in business can work through that framework to be successful at each of those stages of the process.
Yeah, sure. Well, step one may be countercultural for many. The boss comes in, tells you to do something, everyone jumps and says how high, and it's very easy to engage solely on the instruction you've been given. However, as well as doing that, I think it's really useful to genuinely understand the situation and how it's affecting you, to understand that crisis or that failure environment. Clients often misdiagnose problems that they face due to a lack of understanding and some of the understandable biases or egos that kick in. So things we can do during this step are to conduct a project health check, review the current project status against the original scope, timeline, the budget, and the goals. Not the scope, the timeline, the budget, and the goals that the project teams or the stakeholders are working to now in crisis. Go back to what the original requirement was. It's extraordinary how often project teams lose sight of those things and diverge from them. And by doing that, you'll be able to identify which aspects of the project have deviated from the plan and begin to understand perhaps why. You could use tools such as the Create Cadence diagnostic tool that I know you've broadcast on various channels. Really useful to pinpoint the potential causes of failure fast and to deliver actionable insights to get projects back on track. And then another method we could use is what's known as a capability maturity assessment. Pulling in a small team for a couple of weeks, maybe a month with good access to evaluate the more broad processes, systems, and practices that the project team are deploying or that the broader organizational business unit is deploying, and then rate them in terms of maturity against best-in-class standards. And if we do something like that, then we can highlight areas of strength and relative weakness that may help us to diagnose the project crisis or failure that we're facing. And to your point earlier on, these types of tools get beyond the ego that people will inevitably have. They get beyond the blame game, and they help to provide a really objective and open and honest evidence base and understanding of the problem that we're facing.
Yeah,
it's another way of saying root cause analysis, really.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. That was the word I was thinking when we were talking of objectivity, because it's very hard in a project team for the team to have objectivity because they're often under the cosh and in the thick of the work, and it's having someone who's a step away from it is often really beneficial, isn't it, to be able to look at it or an objective tool to use that can make that sort of assessment.
And there's an inevitable plug here for external support. Contracted, consulting, whatever. Maybe a more palatable term to use in terms of a business case is third line assurance. Having a genuinely external party come in and facilitate these sorts of working groups to deploy these sorts of methodologies to get to the root cause has its place, because it is difficult to get to root causes if you're a part of the problem.
Yeah.
but it is a requirement to do it if you're going to pull your project out of crisis
Yes.
and avoid
Yeah,
failure.
absolutely. So right, let's move on. Next, so next stage in the process was about stabilization. How do organizations go about getting into more of a stable place once you've understood the root causes of the problem?
Yeah, how do we stop the bleeding? Well, the first thing
Mm.
is accept that there is a problem.
Hmm.
That's harder actually than than it might seem. You've got to accept the fact that there is a problem. The project is bleeding out. We've got to stop that rather than just staying on the treadmill and going forward. So having the confidence to pause the project in extreme cases, that might be necessary to prevent further waste of resource and time and to create the space required to recover a project. It's not easy. It takes courage. It takes selflessness to be able to say, this is going wrong. Let's just stop for a second and reset. And then as a part of this stage, we're identifying critical areas for change. Focus on the most critical components of the project that are causing the crisis. We've discovered those as a part of step one, and prioritize issues such as process defects or budget overruns, team shortages, or supply chain delays. And you'll notice I'm not focusing on people here. It's easy to blame people for project failure because they're the most available thing to take it out on. But most oftentimes it's about the processes or the way that the people have been told to work, or the way that they've been constrained, or the way that they've been briefed or directed that's causing the problem. And here we really need to get beyond phrases like, I think this has happened, and toward what people know or what data proves. Avoid the office politics and the culture of blame, and really respond to the evidence base that was collected in step one. And then you can reallocate resources and do something about recovery.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to, because we're aware of the time, actually, I'm going to group the next sort of three together. So if we think about realigning, implementing the plan, and managing the people, kind of group those together. What are the key steps within each of those steps of
Yeah.
the framework?
In terms of realignment, reaffirm or redefine the scope.
Hmm.
Reaffirm or redefine the user requirement. Go back to what the original aims of the project were and understand whether or not they're still valid. And if they're not, then reset them. Then develop a recovery plan, having invested time and resource and trained and experienced people in setting that plan. And re-establish leadership and reaffirm people's roles within the project environment. And then that will allow you to better implement the recovery plan. And by implementation, what we're talking about is communicate the plan that we've come up with, make sure that all stakeholders understand and hopefully buy into the recovery strategy, reset KPIs, monitor them, hold people to account for them in a way that we probably weren't before if the project has slipped into crisis. Monitor those risks that we've more effectively assessed and try and put preventative measures in place for project relapse. And then create far stronger stakeholder feedback loops so that we have a better notice, if you like, of potential failures occurring in the future, which inevitably they will because of the world we live in.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to jump in with the question that we've had just here around the team, because and this one resonates with me. I've seen this a number of times when you go in to do a recovery project. More often than not, there's one or two members of the team who are not on board with the recovery plan. They're kind of, they disagree with the new approach. They disagree with how things are being done. How do you deal with that sort of situation where you've got team members that are out of line with the direction that the project now needs to take?
Yeah. So it's a great question because it relates, I think, to something that's inevitable. So the first thing that I would do is have a word with myself and make sure that I was in a place whereby I was going to be radically open-minded. You might not have all the answers, even though their answers are different, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong. Be radically open-minded and pull in as many views as possible, as many perspectives as possible as to what's gone wrong and then how you might recover from it. And make sure that these team members that we're talking about in particular genuinely believe that you have listened to them and understood them. And a really easy or useful technique there is to read back their point to them. Write it down, refer to it often. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to agree with the point or that their solution will become a part of the recovery plan, but it is really important to make sure that they feel listened to. And then as we're going through the planning process and we're costing up various options for recovery, then of course we'll include those ideas in our options and then include them, in which case they'll be pleased. Or if for whatever reason you can't or don't want to, or it doesn't make business sense to do so, then ensure that you explain the reasons why so that you don't lose them as hopefully effective team members or their trust. We avoid disenfranchising them. And then quite a useful technique, I think, to really amplify that feeling is to turn their ideas into contingency plans. To make sure that the hazard that they're trying to avoid with their idea is logged as risk. And then you can evidence the fact that you have taken account of their opinions by showing them what you would do about it if their concerns did manifest themselves later on. Now, if they still can't get behind it, then they may be contributing to dysfunction within the team. And after all of that effort has been made to bring them on track and on message and with the team, if they can't move with you, then perhaps it's time to move them on. But hopefully those things would help along the way.
Yeah. I like that, radically open-minded. I guess that's just all about really challenging your own biases, isn't it? Just to make sure you're not kind of closed off to something that could actually be valid. Yeah.
We all have them and we all have an understanding of the project environment, but I doubt that anyone really has a full understanding of the environment they're working in. Not least because if you had a full understanding, then it probably wouldn't be a complex enough environment to demand a project in the first place.
Yeah. That's it's very it's very wise, that. Yes. So then the final two steps in the process around continuous improvement and then finishing the project, getting to the end, maintaining momentum, learning, improving. So yeah, just some your thoughts on those two final steps in the framework.
Yeah, sure. So step 6, continuous improvement, learning and adaptation, consists of tracking project progress and adapting, monitoring the project's recovery progress continuously. And if new challenges arise, then be flexible and further adapt the plan as needed. Continue to ask yourself, how is the situation changing? How is the project environment changing? What do I need to do about it to keep this project valid? And then adjust the plan further if required, and while constantly managing associated stakeholders. Senior sponsors oftentimes don't like constant change in the plan, not least because it has an associated cost. But to freeze a plan and to expect it to deliver without change, I think is just entirely unrealistic in this volatile and uncertain and changeable world that we live in. And while we're doing that, identify lessons along the way and learn from them. Document every lesson that we learn, or at least identify how we've learned from them, and then pass those on to other project teams and also to ourselves when we initiate the next project. And that really talks to step 7 as well. Having regained some momentum in this project, maintain it all the way through to project closure, and conduct a post-mortem project once it's been completed, and take those lessons forward.
Yeah. So actually, again, something you said there, Alex, that I'm going to relate to another question that we've had. The question is, what strategies would you take to deliver difficult messages to senior stakeholders? I guess within a recovery, there's always going to be a time when you have to, well, in my experience, where you have to deliver quite a bad message of whether it's you're not really where you thought you were, or this is going to cost twice what you thought, because the original planning didn't account for X, Y, and Z. How do you deal with that situation of having to deliver a really difficult message to, or even actually, because what you were saying there was about uh, getting a stakeholder to understand that actually a plan is going to evolve. It's not going to be set in stone. How do you manage those difficult messages and those conversations with senior stakeholders to get them into the place of where the project is really at?
Mm. Sure. Well, I would start by delivering um, more regular updates on the various project problems that you're dealing with from the beginning. And then when it comes to the point of crisis or near failure, the senior is used to having updates or briefings on problems. And then in this case, what you're saying is, having solved 9 or 10 issues along the way without having had to come to you, this one is so big that I've had to come to you. And that avoids a place that so many teams get to where they don't brief or want to own up to problems along the way. And then the first time they talk to the senior sponsor is when a crisis has occurred. And that is often a shock to that person. I mean, why wouldn't it be? It would be a very human response. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't respond badly to the news, but it may at least have inoculated them to bad news along the way. Anyway, when it comes to delivering the news, again, I would try to conduct a period of shaping, go in soft, talk to them one-on-one, send them a warning that a crisis has been identified or we're near failure and the reasons why, and follow it up with them personally before going, to a more open briefing. Your boss isn't going to thank you very much if the first time they hear about the problem is either from their boss or in a board meeting. Be radically honest as well as open-minded with your team and with your seniors about what's going wrong as well as what's going right. Sometimes that's countercultural. We think that people need to be happy all the time. I don't think that that's realistic. Better to let them know as early as possible so that they can bring what resource they have available to bear in your support rather than leaving it too late.
Because I think your approach there is quite different to what I've quite often seen in organisations. So, because the approach I've seen, because pretty much every sponsor I've ever worked with has said the last thing I want is a surprises. And I think what I've seen a lot of project managers do is to almost take that advice by hiding things, but I think you're saying the opposite, as in be really open, be really honest, so these things don't, they don't come to you 6 months later and say, why didn't you tell me about all these problems? So I think that's quite a different approach to what people take, and I guess it sounds like it's also quite an effective one.
A second order benefit of doing it that way is that you do build much higher levels of trust between yourself and the managers or the leaders involved. Because if you're going to them and being really honest about things that either have gone wrong or are going wrong, and your solutions for them or the way that you've dealt with them, then they're inevitably going to trust you more when you're telling them all the good things that are happening as well. And so I really would encourage that approach on a number of levels.
Yeah, yeah.
Again, though, there's a cost, I suppose. If you're the only person that's doing it, you may come across as being the constant troublemaker. In a program environment, it's far more useful if all of the project managers are doing the same thing rather than one being radically open-minded and honest and everyone else sweeping their problems below the carpet. I've been that person that is given a regular cadence of bad news, so it doesn't come as a shock when something goes horribly wrong, but standing out as the person who always has problems. That's not great, although I still think it's better than sweeping your problems under the carpet.
Well, given that you've raised this, Alex, I'm like, how do you deal with that situation? Because it feels slightly familiar to me on a program as well. Being the one who wants to be honest about where things are, and there's let's be honest about it. There's a lot of power games that go on in programs. You always get no one wants to be the work stream that's calling the delay. You kind of hide behind other delays, but ultimately that's really detrimental to an organization and to the success of a program. So if you find yourself in that situation, again, what would your advice be on how to deal with it?
I think you just have to make a choice.
Yeah.
Do, on a sort of principles level, uh,
Mm.
are you the sort of person that has the courage and the discipline and the selfless commitment to to raise issues appropriately, and to have something done about them? And can your organization deal with you doing that? And if you have those values and the organization can bear it, then I think you'll be in a good place. The
Mm.
problem becomes when the organization can't bear it or begins to reward those that hide problems as opposed to you for managing risk well, which is, I think, what we're talking about. And I've been in a couple of organizations that can't bear it, and I've chosen to leave because inevitably those organizations are on the road to failure.
Mm. Yeah, no, yeah, very, very true, very true. So we're coming close to the end of our hour. Actually, that's absolutely flown by, Alex. I think a lot as you've been talking, a lot of what you're saying actually reminds me. I know we're both qualified coaches. It actually reminds me a lot of coaching training, because it's really about understanding yourself and your own biases. It's
Mhm.
really about seeing through the detail that gets thrown around to actually what the real problem is sitting underneath, not just listening to what you're told. And then it's about putting an effective and workable plan in to get the project back to where it needs to be with a big smattering of good communication skills thrown in as well. Is that, yeah, I've summarized up this whole framework in about 3 sentences there. But yeah, does that anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, it chimes. And to build on your point about coaching, oftentimes I found that coachees or mentees have been able to um, describe their goals, um, but then less easily identify the reality of where they find themselves and what the real obstacles are in the way of achieving those goals. And that relates to, step one of what we're talking about, genuinely understanding the project environment, getting to the root cause of why they're not achieving their goals in a coaching sense, or why the project isn't delivering in a project sense. Yeah, there are many parallels with the way that we deal with coaching and mentoring.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would always advocate let's not talk about coaching too much, but any project manager to look at doing some coaching qualifications. I think that I think the two roles. There's lots to learn from each side of
Mm.
that coin, I think. Right. So yeah, we're coming up on time. I want to make sure we don't run over. So hopefully that's been a really helpful introduction to a framework for dealing with a project that's in a crisis situation, but also some preventative measures that you can take to ensure your projects don't get to that stage. In the next couple of days following this webinar, we're going to be sharing the framework in a little more detail, so you can take your time and have a look through that, take that away, use it within your projects, your organizations, and as a way to deal with projects that are in crisis. So hopefully that'll be a useful resource for you. I'm just checking, Alex, can you see my screen? Okay, am I sharing?
Yeah, I'm seeing.
Yeah. So this is the framework. So as I say, we're going to send this out with a bit more detail around each of the steps to give you the guidance. But what I wanted to also say to you really is that one of the things that I mean, Alex has alluded to it in what he was saying, but I certainly think when I've been in a situation where I've been in a project that's needed some recovery, it's really important to realize you're not on your own in this. And I think calling on help, whether that's within your organization or outside, is often the best way to get yourself out of the hole when it comes to a project that's in a crisis situation. So having someone who can come in on an objective basis to really support you and help you to understand the root causes of the problems and to develop a plan with you to enable your project, your organization to be a success. So we within Create Cadence have got some tools, some proposals for you for how we can help you do that. Alex mentioned our project diagnostic tool. It's a completely free tool for you to use. It's available through our website, and again, we'll send out details following the webinar, which is just a series of questions that gives you an opportunity to objectively assess where your project is, why you might be facing challenges within your delivery. So that's available for anybody to use anytime, to just take that step back and get a view on where your project is at. We then run a series of sessions as an organization where we come in and help our clients. Starting off with we call it a Kickstarter session. So a 1-day session to come in. This is typically where there's a project, as we've said, a single project that's having challenges, teams that are having challenges working within projects, where we can spend a day with the organization, with the team, to get quick, actionable insights into what's going on and what they could do to improve the situation, to speed up the delivery on a particular project. So we focus on a problem. We spend the day with the team, interview key people within the project, and we produce a detailed report then out the back of it with some actionable insights for you to be able to take and to get your project back on track. The second thing we do is a bit more an in-depth assessment, which we call an acceleration sprint. So this is typically a 6-week program of work where we look to do more of a detailed realignment of a project. So we can help to do a restructure, to pull together a plan that can enable you then to clear the roadblocks, have a working optimized process to move forward with your project. And again, Alex mentioned other sort of uses for this type of work are to look at delivery life cycles. So to make sure to have a look at either business functions or change life cycles, to complete a full assessment, to provide some detailed recommendations, again, actionable steps that you can take to improve the delivery capability within your organization. So that's our 6-week accelerator sprint. And then finally, we do a full delivery option within the work that we do. This is where we come in and we'll land a project team. If you're starting a project, or if you've need some additional help in terms of implementation, we can bring in a dedicated project team to handle the project lifecycle from the scoping through to the execution to delivery, and we take full ownership of that on an outcome success-based way of working, to make sure that we can really accelerate your business's delivery, support your internal teams, and get you to where you need to be in terms of your projects. So those are the three really the key services that we provide as an organization. You know, we love coming in, helping organizations to get their project delivery to where it needs to be, to achieve the outcomes that they want within their organizations. So I'll stop sharing that. So yeah, so we're coming up on time now. So I mean, Alex, thank you very much, first off, for sharing all of your experiences and insights. It's been really helpful. I'm taking away a few new phrases. Radically open is one of them, with thinking about your own biases. Lots of really good insights like that, I think, that to take away from that. So thank you, first off. And yeah, thank you to everyone who's joined on the webinar today. I really hope you've picked up some useful insights yourself that you can take away and implement in your projects and within your organization. And as I said, we're going to follow up the webinar with some more detail around the framework, around the steps, for you to take away. And we're always here, both Alex and I are sort of here for a conversation. If anything you're taking from this, you'd like to chat more with us about, to understand a bit more about how these sort of steps can help you in the situation you're in, more than happy to have conversations around that to help you and support you in any way that we can. So yeah, that's it. That's great. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Alex, and I hope to see you on the next webinar.